I learned something important the day an entire ballroom laughed at the wrong woman. Crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across the grand ballroom of the Sterling Foundation's annual charity gala, where New York's wealthiest business leaders gathered in tailored tuxedos and elegant evening gowns to celebrate generosity while quietly competing for influence. Waiters moved gracefully through the crowd, carrying silver trays filled with sparkling water and gourmet appetizers, while a string quartet played softly beneath the soaring ceilings. Hannah Brooks stood near the registration table reviewing guest lists and donation records with practiced efficiency. She wore a simple navy blue evening dress that fit comfortably rather than fashionably, her chestnut hair neatly pinned back, and a calm expression that reflected years of choosing confidence over approval. She knew she did not resemble the glamorous socialites filling the ballroom, but she had long ago stopped measuring her worth by mirrors or whispered opinions. Her responsibility was making sure the event succeeded, and she intended to fulfill it with the same quiet excellence she brought to every assignment. Near the center of the room, a small group of influential donors noticed Hannah as she crossed the marble floor carrying updated seating arrangements. One elegantly dressed woman glanced toward her before speaking loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Someone should have mentioned that this gala has a formal dress code. Soft laughter rippled through the group. Another guest smiled with practiced cruelty. Maybe the catering staff wandered into the wrong section. Hannah continued walking without reacting, pretending not to hear, until the first woman stepped directly into her path. "Excuse me," she said with a sweet smile that never reached her eyes. "Would you mind moving a little faster? Some of us are trying to enjoy the evening." Several guests turned to watch. Conversation slowed. The string quartet continued playing, but the atmosphere around Hannah grew painfully quiet. She looked at the woman for a long moment before answering with remarkable composure. "I have no intention of disturbing your evening," she said politely. "Then perhaps you should avoid standing where people have to look at you." Another voice added from behind the group. More laughter followed. Hannah slowly lowered the folder in her hands. She neither raised her voice nor allowed anger to control her expression. Instead, she met the woman's eyes with calm dignity and said, "Do not ever speak to me like that again." The sentence was quiet, but every word carried unmistakable strength. The laughter stopped instantly. No shouting followed. No dramatic confrontation unfolded. There was only silence, broken by the faint music drifting across the ballroom. At the far end of the room, Dominic Hayes had witnessed every second. The powerful Mafia Boss had arrived only moments earlier for a private meeting with the Foundation's board, but he had paused before entering the main reception after noticing the growing crowd. Tall, impeccably dressed in a black tailored suit, Dominic remained almost unnoticed among the guests despite the quiet authority surrounding him. He watched Hannah stand completely alone before a room filled with influential people, yet she refused to surrender her dignity for their approval. Instead of looking embarrassed, she looked unwavering. Something about that single sentence caught his attention more completely than any business proposal he had reviewed that week. Then, to the surprise of everyone standing nearby, Dominic smiled. It was not an amused smile or one filled with mockery. It was the faint, knowing smile of a man who had just recognized uncommon courage. Hannah had no idea who he was, and Dominic made no effort to interrupt the moment. He simply observed as she calmly stepped around the group, continued toward the registration desk, and resumed helping arriving guests exactly as though nothing unusual had happened. While others whispered about the confrontation, Dominic found himself watching only one person in the crowded ballroom. For the first time in many years, someone had impressed him without wealth, influence, or beauty defined by fashion. She had earned his attention with something far rarer. She had protected her self-respect when everyone else expected her to surrender it. The quiet after humiliation often reveals who people truly are. As conversations slowly resumed around the ballroom, Hannah Brooks returned to the registration desk without changing her pace or allowing the cruel exchange to affect the professionalism she had spent years building. She welcomed arriving guests with the same warm smile, verified reservations, directed sponsors toward their assigned tables, and answered every question with patience. If anyone expected tears or anger, they found neither. She simply continued doing her job as though dignity mattered more than applause. Across the ballroom, however, Whispers had already begun spreading. Several guests quietly repeated the confrontation with exaggerated details, turning a moment of unnecessary cruelty into the evening's favorite topic. Some claimed Hannah had embarrassed wealthy donors. Others suggested she lacked the social awareness required for prestigious events. Not a single person mentioned the insults that had provoked her response. Dominic Hayes listened without joining any conversation. Standing beside members of the foundation's executive board, he accepted greetings with polite professionalism while his attention repeatedly returned to the woman calmly organizing the event from the opposite side of the ballroom. She never once looked toward the people who had mocked her. Instead, she noticed an elderly guest struggling to carry a heavy coat and immediately stepped forward to help. Minutes later, she quietly escorted a nervous young volunteer to the correct conference room after noticing the teenager had become overwhelmed by the crowd. Then she solved a seating mistake before it became visible to the event organizers. Every action reflected careful attention to other people rather than concern for herself. Dominic found the contrast remarkable. The people who had spoken most loudly about kindness during the charity gala had shown very little of it. The woman they had chosen to ridicule practiced it naturally, without expecting recognition. During dinner service, another unexpected problem interrupted the evening. One of the guest speakers became delayed by traffic, forcing organizers to reorganize the entire presentation schedule within minutes. Several coordinators began speaking over one another, while volunteers searched frantically for revised programs. Hannah quietly stepped into the confusion, gathered the updated information, reassigned responsibilities with calm efficiency, and restored order before most guests realized anything had changed. The foundation president sighed with visible relief. "Thank you, Hannah," he said sincerely. "You saved us again." She smiled modestly. Everyone worked together. Dominic noticed that she accepted no personal credit even after solving the crisis. Later, while guests enjoyed dessert, Hannah finally stepped into a quiet hallway for a brief moment alone. She leaned lightly against the wall, closed her eyes for several seconds, and took one slow breath before straightening her shoulders once more. The hurt she refused to display in public surfaced only in that empty hallway where no applause and no criticism could reach her. Before she could return to the ballroom, another volunteer approached looking anxious about misplaced auction documents. Hannah immediately smiled again, accepted the folder, and walked back inside without mentioning what had happened earlier that evening. Dominic had followed at a respectful distance, not intending to invade her privacy, but unable to ignore the quiet strength she continued displaying. He watched her transform private pain into calm professionalism within a single breath. Few people possessed that kind of discipline. As the gala drew toward its conclusion, the guests who had mocked Hannah laughed comfortably among themselves, convinced the evening had ended in their favor. They never noticed Dominic observing them with thoughtful silence before turning his attention back toward Hannah one final time. She remained completely unaware that the most influential man in the room had spent the entire evening studying not her appearance, but her character. While everyone else remembered the woman they had underestimated, Dominic remembered the courage it took to remain kind after being publicly humiliated, and for reasons he could not yet explain. He knew this would not be the last time their paths crossed. Sometimes the people everyone overlooks are quietly holding the entire room together. 3 days after the charity gala, Dominic Hayes found himself thinking about Hannah Brooks far more often than he expected. He had negotiated international business agreements worth hundreds of millions of dollars without losing concentration, yet a single sentence spoken with quiet dignity continued echoing through his mind. Instead of asking his security team to investigate her, he chose a different approach. He wanted facts that revealed character rather than rumors fueled by gossip. Through the Sterling Foundation's executive director, Dominic learned that Hannah worked as the organization's senior event coordinator and had been responsible for nearly every successful fundraising gala during the past 5 years. Curious, he accepted an invitation to visit the foundation's headquarters under the reasonable excuse of discussing a future partnership. The office occupied 3 modest floors inside a restored historic building in Midtown Manhattan. There were no marble hallways or luxurious executive suites, only bright workspaces filled with dedicated employees preparing community outreach programs. Dominic arrived without unnecessary attention, accompanied only by one trusted assistant. As he walked through the office, he immediately noticed Hannah seated beside a young intern who appeared close to tears after accidentally deleting an important presentation. Rather than criticizing the mistake, Hannah calmly smiled and said, "Computers can be patient teachers if we are patient students. We will rebuild it together." Within minutes, she had helped recover most of the missing work while encouraging the embarrassed intern to breathe slowly and focus on one step at a time. The young woman left the desk smiling with renewed confidence. Hannah accepted no praise after solving the problem. She simply moved to the next task, waiting for her attention. Dominic continued observing throughout the morning. A maintenance employee struggled to carry several heavy supply boxes into a storage room, and before anyone could ask, Hannah quietly held the doors open and helped organize the deliveries. When a receptionist forgot to eat lunch because of an overwhelming workload, Hannah divided her own homemade meal into 2 equal portions without mentioning the sacrifice. Later, she spent nearly 20 minutes listening to an elderly volunteer who wanted nothing more than someone willing to hear stories about her late husband. Every interaction carried the same gentle sincerity. She treated the chief executive, the newest intern, and the cleaning staff with exactly the same respect. During the afternoon planning meeting, Dominic finally participated in discussions regarding future charitable initiatives. While executives debated budgets and sponsorship opportunities, Hannah remained focused on practical solutions that would help families rather than impress donors. She suggested simplifying scholarship applications so parents with limited time would not feel discouraged from applying. She recommended expanding transportation assistance for senior citizens attending medical appointments. Every idea centered on making life easier for people who rarely appeared in newspaper headlines. Dominic found himself listening to her more carefully than anyone else in the room. Not because she spoke the loudest, but because every suggestion reflected genuine compassion supported by thoughtful planning. As the meeting concluded, several board members congratulated Dominic on his generous contributions before leaving for other appointments. Hannah quietly stayed behind to organize scattered documents and return chairs to their proper places. She assumed the billionaire businessman had already departed until she looked up and found Dominic carrying a stack of presentation folders toward the storage cabinet. She blinked with visible surprise. "You really do not have to help," she said politely. Dominic smiled faintly as he placed the folders neatly on the shelf. "Perhaps not," he answered calmly. "But I have discovered that the people worth respecting rarely ask whether a task belongs to them before helping someone else." Hannah looked at him for a brief moment, uncertain whether he was simply being courteous or speaking from genuine conviction. Before she could respond, another employee called her name from the hallway, and she excused herself with the same gracious professionalism she showed everyone. Dominic watched her disappear around the corner, increasingly convinced that the strongest thing about Hannah Brooks had never been her courage during the gala. It was the quiet consistency with which she chose kindness every single day, even when nobody important seemed to be watching. The hardest truths are usually hidden behind the strongest smiles. During the weeks that followed, Dominic Hayes continued finding reasons to support the Sterling Foundation, but the donations were no longer the only reason he visited. Every trip revealed another quiet act of kindness from Hannah Brooks, another reminder that genuine character rarely demanded attention. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Dominic arrived unexpectedly to finalize funding for a youth education program. As he walked through the nearly empty office, he noticed Hannah preparing boxes filled with school supplies for children in underserved neighborhoods. She worked carefully, checking every backpack twice to make certain each child would receive the same notebooks, pencils, and art materials. A volunteer apologized after accidentally damaging several folders. Hannah simply smiled and said, "Children will never know the difference if we solve the problem together." Her calm voice immediately eased the volunteer's embarrassment. Later that afternoon, Dominic met privately with the foundation's executive director. Their discussion naturally turned toward Hannah after Dominic complimented her professionalism. The director smiled warmly before becoming unusually thoughtful. "Most people see Hannah exactly as she wants them to," he said quietly. "They see someone dependable, cheerful, and resilient. Very few people know what it cost her to become that person." Dominic listened without interrupting. The director continued carefully. "Several years ago, Hannah was one of the most energetic volunteers we had. She loved hiking, community races, and weekend charity walks. Then her mother was diagnosed with an aggressive autoimmune illness. Hannah became her full-time caregiver while still working here. Hospital visits replaced vacations. Sleepless nights replaced weekends. Stress became part of daily life. During those years, she gained weight while putting every ounce of energy into helping someone else survive. Dominic remained silent, allowing every word to settle. Her mother passed away 2 years ago, the director said softly. Most people assumed Hannah would finally focus on herself. Instead, she continued volunteering, mentoring new staff, and helping anyone who needed encouragement. She never once complained about the comments people made regarding her appearance. Dominic looked toward the hallway where Hannah was laughing gently with 2 teenage volunteers while helping them carry donation boxes toward a delivery van. Nothing about her expression suggested someone carrying years of grief. She smiled exactly the same way she had during the gala after enduring public humiliation. The director lowered his voice even further. Do you know what surprised me most after her mother's funeral? Dominic slowly shook his head. The very next Monday, Hannah came to work because she did not want our scholarship event to be canceled. She said families were already counting on us, and her personal pain should never become someone else's disappointment. Dominic found himself unable to answer immediately. For the first time in years, admiration replaced calculation. Every successful negotiation in his career had been built on understanding motivation. Yet Hannah's choices came from something money could never purchase. They came from quiet devotion. As Dominic prepared to leave the building that evening, he noticed Hannah standing alone outside beneath the covered entrance watching steady rain fall across the sidewalk. She waited patiently while an elderly volunteer searched for misplaced car keys, refusing to leave until she knew the woman could drive home safely. Dominic stepped beside her and offered a large umbrella. You will be waiting a while if you insist on protecting everyone before yourself, he said gently. Hannah smiled with the same warmth. He had begun recognizing. People have always been worth waiting for. Their eyes met for only a moment before the elderly volunteer happily announced that the missing keys had been found. Hannah thanked Dominic for the umbrella, returned it with quiet appreciation, and walked into the rain beside the volunteer to make certain she reached her car safely. Watching her disappear beneath the gray evening sky, Dominic realized the cruel words spoken at the gala had described only her appearance. They had completely failed to recognize the extraordinary strength hidden inside the woman everyone else had been too distracted to truly see. Respect becomes unforgettable the moment someone with real power chooses to use it for someone else instead of themselves. 1 month after the charity gala, the Sterling Foundation hosted a strategic planning conference attended by corporate sponsors, nonprofit leaders, and several influential investors interested in expanding community programs across New York. Dominic Hayes accepted the invitation as the keynote sponsor, while Hannah Brooks coordinated every detail behind the scenes with her usual quiet precision. By mid-morning, the conference was running flawlessly. Volunteers moved confidently between meeting rooms, presentation screens displayed the correct schedules, and guests repeatedly complimented the organization's professionalism. Hannah answered every question with patience, never drawing attention to herself despite being responsible for almost every successful detail. During the afternoon executive session, however, an unexpected problem emerged. A major corporate sponsor arrived frustrated after receiving outdated financial documents prepared by one of his own assistants before the conference. Without reviewing the facts, he publicly blamed the foundation's planning team. Several executives turned toward Hannah because she supervised event logistics. Before she could calmly explain what had actually happened, another sponsor recognized her from the charity gala. He smiled with unmistakable arrogance and said loudly enough for the room to hear, "Perhaps organization is not her strongest talent after all. She certainly attracts attention for other reasons." A few uncomfortable laughs spread across the conference table. The atmosphere immediately grew tense. Hannah looked around the room, realizing once again that people were judging appearances before evidence. She inhaled slowly, opened the correct project folder, and politely began explaining the document timeline. The revised financial reports were delivered to every sponsor yesterday afternoon, she said calmly. I also brought printed confirmation records if anyone would like to review them. Before she could continue, the same man interrupted with another dismissive remark. Maybe someone else should handle the presentation. Silence followed. Several executives lowered their eyes rather than challenge one of the conference's wealthiest donors. Hannah remained composed, but Dominic had heard enough. He slowly placed his fountain pen on the polished conference table and looked directly at the sponsor. His voice never became louder than normal, yet every person in the room immediately listened. "Mr. Langford," Dominic said evenly, "there is something far more concerning than a misplaced document." The room became completely silent. Dominic continued without anger. "A person who forms conclusions before reviewing facts demonstrates poor judgment. A person who insults another professional instead of accepting responsibility demonstrates poor character." No one moved. Dominic turned toward Hannah. "Miss Brooks, would you please continue your presentation?" Hannah nodded respectfully and displayed the distribution records on the large conference screen. Timestamps, confirmation receipts, and electronic acknowledgments clearly showed that every required document had been delivered correctly. The outdated version had originated from the sponsor's own office before the conference even began. A long silence settled across the room as several executives quietly reviewed the evidence. Mr. Langford's confident expression slowly disappeared. Dominic looked back toward him with calm authority. "Competence speaks through preparation," he said. Miss Brooks prepared exceptionally. The mistake was not hers. He paused briefly before adding one final sentence. "At Brooks Holdings, we evaluate people by integrity, accountability, and results. Appearance has never been part of our performance standards, and I have no intention of changing that today." The conference room remained silent for several more seconds before the foundation president thanked Hannah for her professionalism and asked her to continue leading the meeting. She completed the presentation with the same calm confidence she had shown from the beginning, never mentioning the insults again. As executives applauded the successful conclusion of the session, Hannah briefly looked toward Dominic. He simply gave a small nod before returning his attention to the meeting agenda, as though defending basic human dignity required no recognition at all. In that quiet moment, everyone in the room understood something that had escaped them for far too long. The most respected man present had not chosen to stand beside Hannah because she needed rescuing. He had stood beside her because truth deserved a voice, and respect belonged to every person willing to earn it. The moment truth stands in the light, those who built their confidence on judgment begin searching for places to hide. News of the conference spread through New York's business community far faster than anyone expected. Executives who had attended quietly repeated the same story during board meetings and networking dinners. They did not talk about financial reports or investment opportunities. They talked about the moment Dominic Hayes publicly defended Hannah Brooks with calm authority while exposing careless assumptions through undeniable facts. Within days, several organizations contacted the Sterling Foundation requesting Hannah's assistance with major fundraising events. Her reputation for professionalism had suddenly become impossible to ignore. Ironically, the people who had dismissed her only weeks earlier now spoke about her as one of the most capable event strategists in the nonprofit sector. Hannah accepted every compliment with the same modest smile she had always worn. She never mentioned the conference or the embarrassment suffered by those who had underestimated her. To her, the work itself remained more important than recognition. One Monday morning, the foundation received an unexpected invitation from Brooks Holdings. Dominic had proposed a citywide community partnership combining corporate resources with nonprofit outreach to expand educational opportunities for underserved families. The initiative would require careful leadership, exceptional organization, and someone capable of coordinating government agencies, private sponsors, volunteers, and community organizations at the same time. During the planning meeting, several senior executives immediately recommended experienced consultants from prestigious firms. Dominic listened patiently before placing a single folder on the conference table. Inside was Hannah's complete portfolio of successful projects from the previous 5 years. Every event had finished under budget, exceeded fundraising expectations, and received outstanding community feedback. "There is already someone fully qualified," Dominic said calmly. A board member looked surprised. "Miss Brooks," Dominic nodded. "She has been solving problems that many consultants charge enormous fees to solve. The difference is that she does it because she believes in the mission rather than the recognition." Across town, Hannah was completely unaware of the conversation unfolding. She spent the morning helping volunteers organize donations for a neighborhood literacy program when the executive director asked her to step into his office. Smiling warmly, he handed her the official proposal from Brooks Holdings. Hannah carefully read every page before looking up in disbelief. "They want me to direct the entire partnership?" The executive director laughed softly. "Actually, they insisted." Hannah hesitated. "There are people with much more experience." "Perhaps," he replied gently. "But experience does not always create trust. You already have that." Later that afternoon, Hannah arrived at Brooks Holdings for the first planning session. The headquarters reflected everything people expected from Dominic Hayes: elegant architecture, polished marble floors, quiet efficiency, and disciplined professionalism. As she entered the executive conference room, she noticed several familiar faces, including two individuals who had laughed during the charity gala months earlier. Their confident expressions faded almost immediately when Dominic stood and welcomed Hannah before everyone else. "Thank you for accepting our invitation," he said sincerely. "This project will succeed because of your leadership." The room became noticeably quiet. Dominic did not exaggerate or flatter her. He simply stated what he believed to be true. Hannah accepted the compliment with characteristic humility. "I will do my best to serve every family this partnership reaches." Throughout the meeting, executives repeatedly turned toward Hannah for guidance regarding scheduling, logistics, volunteer coordination, and community outreach. Each answer she provided was thoughtful, practical, and remarkably well organized. Even those who had once questioned her abilities found themselves taking careful notes as she explained solutions they had not considered. By the end of the afternoon, respect had replaced doubt throughout the conference room. As everyone prepared to leave, Dominic remained behind for a moment, watching Hannah gather her folders with quiet concentration. He realized the transformation had never been about changing how she saw herself. Hannah had believed in her own worth long before anyone else finally learned to see it. The only thing that had changed was that the rest of the world was beginning to catch up. The greatest victories are not announced by applause. They are revealed when the truth quietly changes the way people see another human being forever. In the weeks following Hannah Brooks's appointment as Executive Director of Community Strategy, the partnership continued exceeding every expectation. New educational centers opened across neighborhoods that had long been overlooked, volunteer registrations doubled, and corporate sponsors who had originally participated for publicity began investing genuine time and resources into the communities they served. Reporters frequently requested interviews with Dominic Hayes, assuming the billionaire behind Brooks Holdings had personally designed every successful initiative. Each time, Dominic answered the same way: "If you want to understand why this partnership works, speak with the woman who leads it every day." Before long, Hannah found herself standing before cameras she had never wanted, answering questions with the same humility she had shown while organizing folding chairs and carrying supply boxes months earlier. She never spoke about personal sacrifice. Instead, she highlighted teachers, volunteers, social workers, and families whose determination inspired every project. The public admired her honesty because it never sounded rehearsed. One autumn evening, the Sterling Foundation hosted its annual celebration of service, honoring individuals whose work had transformed lives throughout the city. The ballroom looked remarkably similar to the one where Hannah had first endured public humiliation. The same crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished marble floors. Many of the same business leaders attended once again. Yet everything felt different. As guests arrived, several people approached Hannah simply to thank her for changing their communities. Parents introduced children who had received scholarships through the partnership. Volunteers proudly described programs she had encouraged them to create. The woman who had once been ignored now became the person everyone hoped to meet. During the awards ceremony, the foundation president stepped onto the stage carrying a sealed envelope. This year's Humanitarian Leadership Award recognizes someone whose compassion has influenced thousands of lives, he announced. After a brief pause, he smiled warmly. "Hannah Brooks." The ballroom erupted into genuine applause. Hannah slowly walked toward the stage, visibly moved by the unexpected recognition. As she accepted the award, the audience remained standing. Looking across the room, she noticed several familiar faces, including the elegant woman who had mocked her appearance during the charity gala months earlier. The woman quietly approached after the ceremony ended, her expression no longer filled with confidence, but with sincere regret. "Miss Brooks," she said softly, "I owe you an apology that should have been given a long time ago. I judged you by something that had nothing to do with your character. I was wrong." Hannah looked at her for a gentle moment before smiling kindly. "Thank you for saying that. We all have opportunities to become better people. I believe accepting those opportunities matters more than pretending we never needed them." The woman nodded gratefully, her eyes quietly filling with emotion before walking away. Dominic had witnessed the entire conversation from across the ballroom. Once again, Hannah had chosen grace instead of revenge. Later that evening, after the final guests departed, Dominic and Hannah stood together near the tall windows overlooking Manhattan's glowing skyline. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Hannah smiled softly. "Do you remember the first time we saw each other?" Dominic nodded. "You were the only person in the room who refused to surrender your dignity." Hannah laughed quietly. "I thought everyone remembered the way I looked." Dominic turned toward her with calm sincerity. "No, I remembered the way you carried yourself when kindness would have been easier to abandon." Hannah lowered her eyes briefly before meeting his gaze again. For the first time since that unforgettable evening, she understood why Dominic had smiled instead of speaking. He had recognized her true strength long before the rest of the world ever learned her story. And in that quiet realization, Hannah finally understood that the greatest form of respect is being seen exactly as you are and still being valued beyond measure. Real love does not begin when someone changes for the world. It begins when another person sees their true worth before the world ever does. Nearly a year passed after the partnership transformed communities across New York, and the lives of everyone involved had quietly changed in ways no financial report could ever measure. The educational programs continued expanding, thousands of families received new opportunities, and the Sterling Foundation became a model for charitable collaboration throughout the country. Yet the achievement Dominic Hayes valued most could never be displayed on a balance sheet. It was watching Hannah Brooks walk into every room with the same quiet confidence she had possessed from the beginning. Except now the world finally greeted her with the respect she had always deserved. She remained exactly the same woman who had comforted frightened volunteers, carried donation boxes, and patiently listened to lonely strangers. Success had never changed her because kindness had always been her greatest strength. One crisp spring afternoon, the foundation officially opened a new community learning center funded jointly by Brooks Holdings and several local organizations. Children laughed as they explored colorful classrooms filled with books, computers, music rooms, and art studios. Parents thanked volunteers while teachers welcomed families through the front doors. Reporters gathered outside expecting another speech celebrating corporate generosity. Instead, Dominic invited Hannah to stand beside him before the ribbon-cutting ceremony began. Looking toward the crowd, he smiled quietly before speaking. "People often ask me why I chose to invest so deeply in this partnership. They expect me to describe market research, financial planning, or long-term strategy." He paused briefly before turning toward Hannah. "The truth is much simpler. One evening, I watched a woman protect her dignity after being treated without kindness. She reminded me that character is revealed most clearly when nobody expects you to remain compassionate. Everything we built afterward began with that single lesson." The audience applauded warmly, but Hannah looked visibly moved. After the ceremony, families filled the new center while children proudly showed their parents' classrooms that would soon become places of opportunity. Dominic and Hannah quietly walked through the peaceful courtyard behind the building, where blooming flowers surrounded wooden benches beneath tall maple trees. For several moments, neither felt the need to speak. Finally, Hannah smiled gently. "You know something?" she asked. Dominic looked toward her. "For years, I believed the hardest part of my life was learning to ignore what people thought about me." She paused before continuing. "Now I realize the hardest part was believing someone might someday see beyond it." Dominic answered with calm sincerity. "I never saw beyond it." Hannah looked at him curiously. He smiled. "I saw through it. Everything people used to judge was only the surface. The woman I respected was standing there from the very first moment." Hannah laughed softly through grateful tears. "That is still the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me." Dominic reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small silver pin shaped like an open book, the symbol chosen for every future community center created through their partnership. The board wanted this to recognize the founder of the program, he explained. I told them there was only one person who deserved it. Hannah accepted the pin with trembling hands before looking toward the families filling the building behind them. None of this happened because of me alone, she whispered. Dominic gently shook his head. No great change ever belongs to one person. But every great change begins because one person chooses courage when kindness would be easier to abandon. Hannah smiled as she carefully fastened the pin to her jacket. Without another word, she reached for Dominic's hand, and he quietly held hers as they looked across the playground where children laughed without fear of judgment. In that peaceful moment, neither wealth nor appearance carried any importance. What remained was something far stronger than admiration and far deeper than attraction. It was the certainty that two people had found each other through respect, compassion, and unwavering dignity. The woman who had once stood alone before a room filled with laughter had discovered a place where she would never have to defend her worth again. And the man who had spent years trusting power more than people finally learned that the greatest privilege in life is protecting a heart that never stopped choosing kindness, no matter how unkind the world had been.